He was a good man, a supportive mentor, a career coach, one worth having as lead. Hey! Wait. Wait. I meant to say, he appeared to be a good man if you do not look closely and clearly. He was my mentor and boss. But he was up to something. The notification didn't arrive with a siren or a thunderclap. It arrived with a polite, digital ping at 2:14 a.m. Most people check their credit scores and see a slight fluctuation, a few points lost to a credit card balance, a few gained for a timely mortgage payment. But when Morven swiped her screen, the number staring back at her didn't just look wrong, it looked impossible. Her score, once a pristine beacon of financial discipline, had cratered into the red. She scrolled down, her breath hitching in the quiet of her apartment. There, nestled among her modest utility bills and student loan installments, sat a behemoth. A commercial loan, recently approved and fully disbursed. Total balance: $1 million. The room felt suddenly devoid of oxygen. To the world, Morven was now a millionaire debtor. To the bank, she was a high-flying entrepreneur with a massive liability. But as she stared at the digital signatures authorized just 3 days ago, the cold dread in her stomach crystallized into a sharp, jagged realization. The signatures weren't just hers, they were perfect. They used the specific, slanted M she only used for internal corporate approvals. Someone hadn't just stolen her name, they had stolen her life from the inside. The fluorescent lights of the office seemed more clinical than usual as Morven walked in at 8 a.m. She sat at her desk, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled up her private encrypted drive. This was the building where she had spent 60 hours a week for the last 3 years, clawing her way up the ladder under the watchful eye of Thane, the firm's golden boy. "Morning, Morven," a smooth, baritone voice echoed. She jumped. Thane was standing by her cubicle, a cardboard sleeve of coffee in one hand and a familiar paternal smile on his face. "You look tired. Late night on the Sinclair files." "Something like that," she managed to whisper, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Looking at him now, the charismatic mentor who had hand-delivered her promotion in recent time, she felt a wave of nausea. He had been so helpful. He had walked her through the new biometric security protocols himself, showing her how to sync her digital ID with the executive server for seamless workflow. As soon as he retreated into his glass-walled office, Morven went to work. She wasn't just a victim, she was a senior forensic analyst. If Thane thought he had picked a quiet mouse to shoulder his debt, he was about to learn why she was the best in the department. She bypassed the standard employee portal, using a backdoor script she developed for stress testing. The loan documents were buried deep in a subdirectory titled Project Phoenix. She opened the primary PDF. There it was. Her name, her social security number, and a forged digital certificate that bypassed the bank's two-factor authentication by routing the confirmation code through a virtual phone line, a line registered to an IP address coming from the building's own server room. The betrayal was surgical. Thane hadn't just taken the money, he had built a cage around her using the very tools she used to protect the firm. He was the ghost in the machine, and he was currently drinking a latte 10 feet away from her. The hunt had begun. The adrenaline of discovery was quickly replaced by a cold, analytical focus. Morven knew that in the world of high finance fraud, an accusation without an airtight data trail was just a career-ending suicide note. She needed to prove not just that the loan existed, but that the digital hand that signed it belonged to the man in the corner office. She pulled the raw metadata from the Project Phoenix loan authorization. To a layman, the digital signature looked identical to the one she used to approve weekly expense reports. But Morven began to strip away the layers of encryption, looking for the digital fingerprint left behind by the software used to generate the file. The signatures were too perfect. They didn't have the slight millisecond lag typical of a remote user signing through a VPN. These had been injected directly into the document from a local administrator terminal. As she cross-referenced the timestamps, her blood ran cold. The loan had been finalized at 6:14 p.m. last Thursday, the exact time Thane had invited her into his office to celebrate her promotion with a glass of scotch. While she had been sitting across from him, distracted by his praise, he had been using her active session on his secondary monitor to authorize the transfer. Morven navigated through the company's internal traffic logs, masked by a secondary administrative protocol. She wasn't looking for her own name anymore. She was looking for an anomaly. She found it tucked behind a firewall exception usually reserved for system maintenance. A series of packets had moved from Thane's terminal to the server room, bypassing the standard logging sequence. It was a sophisticated man-in-the-middle attack, but executed from inside the house. The metadata didn't point to an external hacker in a distant country. The breadcrumbs led directly to the heart of the firm. Just as she prepared to copy the logs to her encrypted drive, she noticed a final, jarring detail in the document's revision history. The Project Phoenix folder hadn't been created recently. It had been sitting dormant for months, a hollow shell waiting for a name to fill it. Her promotion wasn't a reward for her hard work. It was the final piece of Thane's infrastructure. He hadn't chosen her because she was his best analyst. He had chosen her because her security clearance level, once she was promoted, was the exact threshold required to bypass the bank's secondary fraud alert for $1 million disbursement. She realized with terrifying clarity that she wasn't just a scapegoat. She was a pre-planned component in a machine that had been building for a long time. Thane hadn't just stolen her identity. He had engineered her entire career path in recent time to serve as his ultimate exit strategy. The realization that her career had been a curated trap felt like a physical weight. Morven stared through the glass partition at Thane. He was laughing, leaning back in his leather chair while gesturing at a junior associate. Every encouraging word he'd given her in recent time, every growth opportunity he'd pushed her toward, was now recontextualized as a sinister grooming process. She pulled up her own HR file and cross-referenced it with the loan's approval timeline. The correlation was undeniable. The day she was granted Level 4 financial oversight was the exact day the loan application was initiated. He had coached her on the biometric sync not to protect her, but to ensure his forged signatures would carry the hardware-verified stamp of her specific workstation. Thane hadn't just been a mentor. He was an architect building a scaffold. The sudden shift in his attention over the past few months, the late-night strategy sessions and the access to high-level client data, wasn't about her potential. It was about ensuring that when the $1 million disappeared, the digital trail would be so deeply intertwined with her daily duties that no auditor would believe she was innocent. She was being framed with her own success. Morven knew that if the money stayed in a standard account, it would be too easy to claw back. To truly lose $1 million, Thane had to move it into the gray. Using her private forensic toolkit, she began to track the loan disbursement. The capital hadn't gone to a bank. It had been converted into a series of stablecoins and bounced through a mixer to obscure its origin. However, even the most sophisticated mixers leave a ghost of a trail if you know which block to watch. She spent hours mapping the outbound transactions. Thane was using a sophisticated layering technique, moving the funds through 24 different shell companies, most of them registered in offshore jurisdictions. But he had made a classic mistake of arrogance. He used the company's high-speed dedicated terminal to execute the final transfers, believing his internal system maintenance mask would hide him. Morven discovered a recurring digital signature in the smart contracts, Ethelred Holdings. It was a name she'd seen once before on a crumpled receipt in Thane's wastebasket. By tracing the wallet addresses associated with Ethelred, she found the ledger within the ledger. This wasn't just a one-time theft. The $1 million wasn't sitting in a vault. It was being used to prop up a failing real estate development in a different time zone. Thane was borrowing her life to gamble on his own survival. The deeper she dug, the more she realized that the $1 million was just the beginning. The shell companies were hemorrhaging cash, and Thane was preparing to pull the trigger on a second disbursement. She wasn't just fighting for her past credit, she was fighting to stop him from doubling the debt before the week was over. The air in the server room was bone-chilling, a sharp contrast to the humid afternoon outside. Morven stood in the dark, the rhythmic hum of cooling fans and the rhythmic blinking of blue LEDs providing the only company. She knew she had less than 10 minutes before the automated security sweep flagged her unauthorized physical access. She didn't need a crowbar, she needed a bypass. Using a handheld deck sheet prepped in the shadows of her cubicle, she tapped directly into the hardware port of the executive backup drive. If Thane was keeping a shadow ledger that linked his personal accounts to her stolen identity, it wouldn't be on the cloud. It would be here, air-gapped and hidden in the firm's local architecture. Her screen flickered with lines of raw code. Access denied. She felt a bead of sweat roll down her neck despite the cold. She tried a different approach, inputting the biometric override code Thane had taught her during their security sync. Access granted. The irony was bitter. The very tool he used to harvest her data was the key to his undoing. Within a hidden partition labeled Legacy Audit, she found it, a mirrored database of every transaction made under her name, cross-referenced with Thane's private banking credentials at Ethelred Holdings. She initiated the download, watching the progress bar crawl with agonizing slowness. Back at her desk, Morven began the grim task of triangulating the geographical metadata. Forensic accounting was about more than just numbers. It was about physical presence. If she could prove Thane was the one hitting enter on the forged documents, the house of cards would fall. She pulled the IP headers from the original loan application. While the system maintenance mask had successfully hidden his identity from the bank, it hadn't scrubbed the routing hops. One specific hop stood out, a private residential gateway. Using a reverse lookup tool, she mapped the coordinates. They didn't lead to a coffee shop or a public library. The signal originated from a high-end estate in the suburbs, Thane's private home office. The digital trail was now a physical one. Every time the Morven identity had signed a fraudulent document, the signal had pulsed from Thane's personal router while he was supposedly working from home to care for his sick dog. It was the smoking gun she needed. He hadn't just used his office computer, he had brought her stolen life into his home, manipulating her future while sitting in his slippers. But as she saved the coordinates, a notification popped up on her internal messenger. It was from Thane. Morven, are you still in the office? I noticed some unusual activity on the server logs. Come to my office. Let's talk about it. He knew. The hunter had just become the hunted. The walk to Thane's office felt like a march toward a precipice. Morven's mind raced through the psychological grooming she had endured. It wasn't just about the passwords or the keys, it was about the trust she had surrendered. She remembered the day he had requested her high-resolution biometric mapping. He'd framed it as a cutting-edge security upgrade, a way to ensure her identity could never be spoofed by external hackers. In reality, he was harvesting the unique digital signature of her retina and thumbprint to create a master key. By convincing her that this was for her protection, he had gained the ability to bypass every multi-factor authentication wall the bank possessed. He hadn't broken into her life. She had opened the door and handed him the map. The fear was paralyzing, but it sparked a memory of a name whispered in the break room months ago. Sorka. She was a brilliant analyst who had been let go for a supposed clerical error that cost the firm thousands. Morven ducked into a quiet corridor and made a quick, desperate call to a number she'd found in an old directory. When Sorka answered, her voice was hollow. Don't bother fighting it, Sorka warned. He did the same to me. A small loan, a missed oversight. By the time I found the trail, he'd already reported me to HR for the very fraud he committed. He doesn't just steal money, Morven. He steals your credibility so no one will listen when you scream. The pattern was clear. Thane was a serial predator who used his subordinates as disposable batteries for his personal debts. As Morven stood before Thane's glass door, she took one last look at the data on her phone. The $1 million wasn't just for a real estate gamble, it was a desperate plug for a massive, gaping hole in his personal finances. His successful lifestyle was a facade. Between his high-stakes trading losses and a crumbling offshore investment, Thane was drowning. The $1 million wasn't a luxury, it was oxygen. And he was willing to let Morven suffocate to get it. She pushed the door open. Thane was sitting in the shadows, the light from his monitor casting a skeletal glow over his sharp features. Close the door, Morven, he said, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. We need to discuss why you were accessing the legacy audit files. You know those are off limits for your pay grade. The mask was off. The mentor was gone, and the monster was finally visible. Thane's office felt like a pressurized chamber. He sat behind his desk, the silence stretching between them like a tripwire. To him, Morven was a cornered subordinate. To Morven, Thane was a target whose coordinates were already locked. "I was looking for the truth, Thane," Morven said, her voice steadier than she felt. She didn't sit down. "I think we both know what's in those files." Thane leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "What's in those files is proprietary data that you've just made yourself liable for. I could have security escort you out right now. Your career would be over before you hit the sidewalk." "My career is already in jeopardy because of $1 million loan I never signed," she countered. "If I'm going down, I'm not going alone." Thane let out a short, dry laugh. "You think the board will believe a junior analyst over me? I've built this firm. You're just a name on a ledger I can erase." What Thane didn't know was that Morven had already moved beyond the company walls. While walking to his office, she had triggered a pre-written, encrypted, dead man switch email. It wasn't sent to the board, it was sent to the International Fraud Investigation Bureau and a contact she'd made at the lending bank. As Thane began to stand, likely to call security, his desk phone buzzed. Then his private cell. Then his laptop chimed with an urgent, high-priority alert from the firm's compliance department. Morven didn't flinch. "That's the sound of the synchronized strike I've been preparing since lunch. Every account associated with Ethelred Holdings, and every shell company linked to my stolen identity, has just been flagged for immediate freezing by federal investigators." Thane's face went from smug to a sickly, ashen gray. He frantically began typing, his fingers fumbling over the keys. "You're bluffing," he hissed, but his eyes were glued to the screen. "You can't freeze these accounts without a court order." "I didn't need a court order to report an active, ongoing identity theft in recent time," Morven said, leaning over his desk. "I provided them with the geographical metadata from your home office. They aren't just looking at the money, Thane. They're looking at you." The room's temperature seemed to drop further. The predator was no longer staring at a mark. He was staring at the bars of a cage he had built for someone else, now closing around him. The trap was sprung, and for the first time in recent time, Morven was the one in control. The silence in the office was deafening, broken only by the frantic, uneven clicking of Thane's mechanical keyboard. He was a man drowning in digital ink, trying to move shadows that had already been pinned to the light. "The system it's not responding," Thane muttered, his voice losing its authoritative edge, cracking into a high-pitched desperation. He refreshed his browser, the screen reflecting a harsh white light onto his sweating forehead. "I told you," Morven said, her voice dropping to a cold, clinical whisper. "The strike was synchronized. The moment I stepped into this room, the lending bank's fraud department received a packet containing the hardware IDs of your home terminal and the biometric spoofing logs. They didn't just freeze the $1 million, Thane. They froze every asset linked to your name to prevent further dissipation." Thane finally looked up, his eyes wide and bloodshot. The charismatic mentor had evaporated, replaced by a cornered animal. "You don't understand the scale of this, Morven. That money, it was already committed. If those trades don't clear by midnight, the firm's credit rating will be downgraded. You're destroying the company to save yourself." "I'm not destroying the company," she replied, stepping closer until she was looming over his desk. "I'm amputating the rot. You gambled with my life because you thought I was a silent asset. You thought I was a line of code you could edit out when the numbers didn't add up." She watched as he tried one last desperate gambit, a manual override through the executive God mode terminal. He entered his master password, his hand shaking so violently he missed the keys twice. The glass walls that once symbolized Thane's transparency and power now felt like a transparent cage. He stood up abruptly, knocking his ergonomic chair backward. It struck the floor with a dull thud, the only sound in the suffocating room. "You think you've won?" Thane hissed, stepping around the desk to loom over her. He was trying to use his height, his physical presence, the old tools of corporate intimidation. "You've handed the feds a map to our internal servers. You've invited the vultures in to pick at the firm's bones. They'll bury you right alongside me for cooperation in a fraudulent scheme. It's your name on the loan, Morven." Not mine. Morven didn't back down. She didn't even blink. Instead, she reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out her smartphone. The screen was dark, but a small, steady green light pulsed at the top. "I'm not cooperating with you, Thane. I'm testifying against you," she said. She tapped the screen, revealing a live recording interface that had been capturing every word of his frantic admission. "And about that map. I didn't just send them the server logs. I sent them the audio of you admitting the system is not responding to your master override, the one you just tried to use to move stolen funds." Thane's hand twitched, reaching for the phone, but he stopped when the heavy doors at the end of the executive suite swung open. Two men in dark suits, followed by the firm's lead counsel, marched toward the office. "Thane McCallum?" the taller man asked, his voice echoing in the sudden vacuum of the office. "We're with the Financial Crimes Division. We have a warrant for your personal devices and a temporary restraining order on your access to all corporate and private financial networks." The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. Thane looked at Morven, his face a distorted mask of hatred and disbelief. He had spent years teaching her how to identify the human element in a fraud case, never realizing he was the one being analyzed. "You were supposed to be the perfect mark," he whispered, his voice cracking as the investigators moved in to escort him out. "No, Thane," Morven replied, watching as they led him past the rows of stunned employees. "I was your best analyst. You should have checked my work." As the elevator doors closed on his career, Morven felt the crushing weight of the million-dollar debt finally begin to lift. The confrontation was over, but the reclamation was just beginning. The fallout was instantaneous and deafening. As Thane was led out in handcuffs, the corporate machine he'd manipulated for years began to turn on him with mechanical precision. The news of $1 million identity theft at the executive level rippled through the firm's investors like a seismic shock. By noon, the business's credit rating, the very thing Thane had tried to save with Morven's identity, began to collapse. Partners withdrew, and the board of directors scrambled to distance themselves from the Thane McCallum era. For Morven, the victory was bittersweet. She watched from the glass balcony as federal agents carted out boxes of files from Thane's home office, realizing that while his reputation was incinerated, the debris was still scattered across her own life. The firm's internal atmosphere shifted from shock to a cold, professional silence. People who had ignored Morven for years now looked at her with a mixture of awe and fear. She had done the unthinkable. She had hunted the hunter. But as the authorities sifted through the wreckage, Morven faced a new, grueling reality. The handcuffs were on Thane, but the million-dollar shadow still lingered on her credit report. The weeks that followed were a descent into a different kind of hell, the agonizing bureaucracy of innocence. Winning the confrontation was a sprint, reclaiming her name was a marathon. Morven spent her days in recent time navigating the labyrinthine halls of international credit bureaus and legal departments. Even with Thane's confession and the federal indictment, the financial system was not designed to move quickly. She had to provide the same evidence, the forensic logs, the biometric breach reports, the geographical metadata, to dozens of different agencies, each more skeptical than the last. "You have to understand, Ms. Morven," one clerk told her over a flickering video call, "$1 million debt doesn't just disappear. We have to verify every single crumb you provided." It was a process of relentless persistence. She sat in sterile waiting rooms, her eyes burning from staring at legal briefs, meticulously scrubbing the ghost of Thane's greed from her record. She was no longer analyzing someone else's fraud. She was performing surgery on her own future. Every time a notice of correction arrived in the mail, it felt like a lung finally filling with air. She was slowly, painfully, deleting the version of herself that Thane had created. The $1 million loan was being dismantled dollar by dollar, not through payment, but through the sheer, unyielding force of the truth. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was the architect of her own reclamation. The final gavel didn't fall with a loud bang, but with the soft, definitive click of a keyboard. Morven sat in her new office, a space she owned, unburdened by the shadow of a corporate master. On her screen was the final notification from the Central Credit Registry: disputed liability, fully resolved. Account status, deleted. Thane's sentencing had been swift. The evidence Morven gathered was so absolute that his legal team hadn't even attempted a defense. He was ordered to pay full restitution, though Morven knew she would likely never see a cent of his depleted assets. To her, the money wasn't the point. The point was the ledger. It was finally clean. As part of her reclamation, Morven developed a digital framework, a blueprint, for others who found themselves in the crosshairs of high-level corporate fraud. She spent her evenings in recent time consulting for whistleblowers and victims of identity harvesting, teaching them how to audit their own digital footprints. She showed them how to look past the mentorship and see the architecture of betrayal before the first loan is ever signed. She looked at her reflection in the glass window. The naive, loyal analyst who had walked into Thane's office years ago was gone. In her place stood someone who understood that in the digital age, your identity is your most valuable asset, and the person most likely to steal it is the one who claims to be protecting it.